Alright, now we're going to be taking a look at the autonomic nervous system. And when it comes to the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about a part of the nervous system that is responsible for controlling the bodily functions that are not consciously directed. So essentially those that are involuntary. So breathing, the heartbeat, digestive processes. So we're looking at control that is going to cardiac muscle and smooth muscle and glands, whether they be endocrine or exocrine. Now this is in contrast to the somatic nervous system. And that was the part of the peripheral nervous system that was associated with skeletal muscle. That was when we talked about the neuromuscular junction, excitation, contraction, coupling, and the cross-bridge cycle. Some of those steps still happen with cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, but we're not looking at the neuromuscular junction. That's only skeletal muscle. So somatic nervous system, we're looking at body movement, that voluntary movement of the body, whereas autonomic nervous system, we're looking at involuntary movements or secretions. So if we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, we want to talk about what does it include? Well, it includes the neurons that innervate smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as glands. It's also able to make adjustments to ensure optimal support for multiple types of body activities. Again, this is under subconscious control, so it's involuntary. We also note that many of the body's organs, or viscera, is where we're going to find the effectors for the autonomic nervous system. And an effector is just an organ or cell that acts, or basically shows us an effect, in response to a stimulus, and in this case, a stimulus coming from the autonomic nervous system. So let's look at this figure 14.1. We've talked about the central nervous system, we're really getting into the peripheral nervous system, but now we're focusing on the autonomic nervous system, and we will later focus on its two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, and at first just comparing it to the somatic nervous system, we want to look at the three areas where they differ, in their effectors, their efferent pathways, and their target organ responses to neurotransmitters. So first, let's look at the effectors. The effectors of the somatic nervous system are skeletal muscle. So soma means body, so it makes sense the effectors that are going to control or move the body are skeletal muscles. Another name for the somatic nervous system is sometimes the voluntary nervous system, because skeletal muscle is controlled voluntarily. The effectors for the autonomic nervous system, that's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And a lot of these glands are located in your abdominal viscera, or essentially your abdominal organs. So what we're looking at for the autonomic nervous system is essentially a system that controls things subconsciously or involuntarily. But what about their efferent pathways? Well, an efferent pathway is going to be a motor neuron that's sending a signal to an effector. For the somatic nervous system, we tend to see group A fibers that are heavily myelinated, and they're called somatic motor neurons. Usually this is one neuron that's extending from the central nervous system to its effector, which in this case for the somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle. We see actually though two chains of neurons, or two neurons, when it comes to the autonomic nervous system and its efferent pathway. It has a preganglionic, or a central nervous system neuron, and a postganglionic, or peripheral nervous system neuron. Now the central nervous system neuron that's preganglionic tends to be lightly myelinated, whereas the postganglionic neuron tends to be non-myelinated, and it's the postganglionic neuron that extends to the effector organ. So let's take a look at this image here. You can see up at the top it says somatic nervous system, and we're seeing one heavily myelinated axon, and that's an axon of a somatic motor neuron, and at the end it's secreting acetylcholine. And when acetylcholine binds to its effector organs, which is skeletal muscle, it is stimulatory, always. Now if we look down at the bottom, we have kind of two situations, one parasympathetic and one sympathetic, for the autonomic nervous system. And every single part of the autonomic nervous system uses two neurons or two parts to trigger their effector organs. And depending on the neurotransmitter, and we'll see things like acetylcholine and norepinephrine for the autonomic nervous system, and depending on that neurotransmitter, we might have a stimulatory effect or an inhibitory effect. For example, in the somatic nervous system, all somatic motor neurons release acetylcholine. That's what's missing for the blank. And that is going to have an excitatory effect on skeletal muscle. That's what we saw in this last image, up there at the top. For the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers, the first ones, those are going to release acetylcholine. And the postganglionic fibers can release norepinephrine or acetylcholine. And again, on that effector, it depends on the organ whether or not that neurotransmitter is stimulatory or inhibitory. Because norepinephrine and acetylcholine can be both, depending on the receptor it binds to. Note for the sympathetic and parasympathetic, the first neuron or preganglionic neuron is secreting acetylcholine. For the postganglionic structure or neuron, we can get norepinephrine or acetylcholine. Again, this is for the autonomic nervous system. But we tend to see more norepinephrine in postganglionic cells of the sympathetic nervous system. And we tend to see more acetylcholine from the postganglionic cells for the parasympathetic nervous system. Alright, so let's continue on and talk now about the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There's two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic is going to be able to mobilize the body during extreme situations. Think of it as the body hitting the gas pedal. The parasympathetic is going to perform maintenance activities, conserve body energy. You can think of it as the body's brake. And generally, these two divisions counterbalance each other. So the parasympathetic, we want to look at it closer. We can talk about it being concerned with keeping body energy use low and being involved in D activities like digestion, defecation, and diuresis. Diuresis is a fancy term for urination. And this activity by the parasympathetic division is best illustrated if you think of a person who's eating a big meal and relaxing after a meal. Their blood pressure, their heart rate, their respiratory rates will be low, but their gastrointestinal tract activity is high. And their skin is warm and the pupils are constricted. The skin is generally warm because of dilation of the capillaries in the dermis, and the pupils are constricted because they're not worried about fighting or fleeing, so they don't need a lot of light energy entering into their eyes so they can see what's going on around them. Whereas the sympathetic division is the fight or flight system. It's involved in E activities, exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment, and it works best at promoting adjustments during exercise or when you are trying to fight or flee. It'll make sure that blood flow to organs that don't need any blood is reduced during exercise. So we're really going to increase that blood flow to muscles like skeletal muscle. And we'll see its activity of the sympathetic division illustrated best by a person who is threatened, and their heart rate increases, and their breathing is rapid and deep. Their skin might be cold and sweaty, and their pupils dilate to take in as much information as possible if they are going to fight or flee. Now, when we're looking more at those neurotransmitters and receptors secreted by the autonomic nervous system, whether parasympathetic or sympathetic, we want to look at what we call those axons, those motor fibers that are going to the effector cells. Because we know acetylcholine and norepinephrine are the two major neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system. But what do we call acetylcholine releasing fibers? Well, they're called cholinergic fibers. What about if a neuron fiber releases norepinephrine, like the sympathetic postganglionic axons? Those are adrenergic fibers. Keep in mind that acetylcholine is released by all preganglionic autonomic nervous system axons, so all of those preganglionic axons are cholinergic, whereas the postganglionic axons, especially those for the sympathetic nervous system that release norepinephrine, they're adrenergic. Now there can be cholinergic postganglionic fibers. Take a look, for example, at the parasympathetic nervous system here. The second neuron also releases acetylcholine, so that is a postganglionic cholinergic fiber. But also keep in mind still, like we've talked about before, that neurotransmitter effects can be excitatory or inhibitory, but it depends upon the receptor type. So that's been our brief overview of quite a bit of the autonomic nervous system. When we come back, we're going to take a closer look at cholinergic and adrenergic fibers and also receptors. So make sure to watch that video.